Hidden Crime Stories, Episode 1. She Loved Him More Than Them. The Diane Downs Story. Thrown into the fire. The nurse heard the car before she saw it. Tires screeching into the emergency bay. An engine cutting off too fast. Then a car door swinging open and a woman stepping out into the harsh fluorescent light of McKenzie-Willamette Hospital in Springfield, Oregon. It was 10:48 p.m., the 19th of May, 1983. The woman had been shot in the left arm. The wound was bleeding through her sleeve, but she wasn't holding it, wasn't clutching it, wasn't doing any of the things a person in pain instinctively does. She was just standing there, upright, composed, almost impatient. The nurses ran past her, because in the back seat of that car were 3 children, 3 small children, soaked in blood, shot at close range. Christie, 8 years old, Cheryl, 7, Danny, just 3. Cheryl was already gone. The nurses were still screaming for gurneys, still trying to stabilize Christie and Danny, still processing the horror of what they were looking at when one of them glanced back at the woman who had brought these children in. She wasn't crying. She wasn't pacing. She wasn't pressed against the glass, watching them work on her babies. She wasn't doing anything a mother should be doing in that moment. She was asking to use the phone. And the person she called while her children bled, while her daughter lay dead, while the emergency room erupted in chaos around her, was not a family member, not a pastor, not a close friend. It was a man named Robert Knickerbocker, a married man. A man who, investigators would later discover, had made one thing crystal clear to this woman. He did not want children in his life. Her children. The call lasted several minutes. She never cried. Not once. Not that night, and not for a long time after. What happened on Old Mohawk Road that night was not a carjacking. It was not a random act of violence by a stranger. It was a mother who had weighed her children against a man she loved and made a choice. Exactly who Diane Downs was, how she got to that road, and what she thought was waiting for her on the other side. Stay with me, because this story doesn't just tell you what one woman did. It tells you something about how people who are capable of extraordinary cruelty manage to look completely ordinary for years, and what we miss when we aren't paying attention. Who was Diane Downs? Before we go to that road, we need to understand the woman who drove down it. Because Diane Downs was not some shadow figure. She wasn't mysterious or obviously dangerous. She was someone's neighbor, someone's coworker. A woman who smiled at you in the grocery store and chatted about the weather and seemed, by almost every outward measure, completely normal. She was born Elizabeth Diane Fredrickson in Phoenix, Arizona in 1955. She grew up in a strict household, a home where control was the dominant language. Those who knew her from those early years described a girl who was always performing, always working an angle, always calibrating how she appeared to the people around her, because how she appeared was everything. She got married at 17, not for love. She would say so herself, years later, on the witness stand of her own murder trial, with the flat candor of someone who has simply never learned to feel ashamed. I did not marry Steve for love. I married Steve to get out of the family. She and Steve Downs had 3 children. Christie, born 1974. Cheryl, born 1976. And a third child, Danny, whose father was not Steve, but a man Diane had been seeing on the side. People who were around Diane during those years describe something that, in hindsight, turns your stomach. Not explosive cruelty, not dramatic abuse, something quieter and more corrosive than that. A kind of cold indifference toward her children that was almost clinical. She treated them, one observer later said, like obligations, like furniture that sometimes moved and made noise and needed to be managed. Steve Downs, after their divorce in 1980, recounted watching his ex-wife interact with the children and feeling something he couldn't quite name at the time. He described 7-year-old Cheryl sitting on a bed one afternoon, looking up at him and asking whether there was a gun in the house. He asked her why she wanted to know. And his little girl said quietly, without drama, "I want to kill myself. My mom says I'm bad." 7 years old? Hold that detail in your mind, because it is the key to everything that comes after. Diane Downs did not suddenly become a person capable of shooting her children on the 19th of May, 1983. She had been that person for a long time. What changed was simply the calculation, the math of what she stood to gain, and that math had a name: Robert Knickerbocker, a love that destroyed everything. By 1983, Diane was 27, divorced, working a postal route in Cottage Grove, Oregon. She had transferred there from Arizona, partly to start over, and partly because Robert Knickerbocker, a married coworker she had become obsessed with, had made it clear that he wanted distance from her. Let's be specific about what this obsession looked like, because it matters. This was not a heartbroken woman pining for a relationship that had ended badly. This was something more consuming and more frightening than that. Diane kept diaries, private journals that investigators would eventually find and enter into evidence, and in those pages, she wrote about Robert with the kind of intensity that left detectives genuinely unsettled. He consumed her thoughts. He occupied her plans. He was, in her internal world, the entire point. And Robert didn't want her children around. He was direct about it. He had told her, clearly, that he was not interested in raising another person's kids. He didn't want the complication. He didn't want the noise and the chaos and the responsibility. He had said, in words she fully understood, a future with him did not include Christie, Cheryl, and Danny. So Diane Downs began doing what narcissists do when confronted with an obstacle. She started solving the problem. What investigators pieced together in the months following the shooting was a portrait of a woman who had spent weeks thinking through what needed to happen. She chose Old Mohawk Road, deliberately rural, dark, quiet, the kind of place where a story about a stranger could breathe. She thought through the wound she would need. She thought through what she would say. She thought through everything. Except one thing. She didn't plan for Christie to survive. The night Old Mohawk Road. The 19th of May, 1983, a Thursday evening in Oregon. Diane loaded her children into the car. Christie in the back, Cheryl, little Danny. She drove out toward Old Mohawk Road, a stretch of rural highway she knew well from her mail route. She pulled over in the dark. What happened next took only minutes. She produced a .22 caliber pistol. She shot Cheryl. She shot Danny. She shot Christie. Then she turned the gun on her own left arm, controlled, deliberate, shallow enough to bleed, but nowhere near fatal to complete the story she had already written in her head. Then she drove to McKenzie-Willamette Hospital. Cheryl Lynn Downs, 7 years old, died before the doctors could do anything for her. Danny, 3, was shot in the chest and would spend the rest of his childhood partially paralyzed. Christie, 8, had suffered a massive stroke from blood loss. She could barely move. She could barely speak. And their mother stood at the nurse's station and told the story of the bushy-haired stranger on the dark country road. The carjacking, the struggle, the shot in her arm. She told it clearly, calmly, with the practiced ease of someone who has rehearsed. Then she made her phone call. Detective Doug Welch got the call to McKenzie-Willamette Hospital that night. He was relatively young. This was one of his first homicide investigations. He sat across from Diane Downs and listened to her story and felt, from the first few minutes, that something was profoundly wrong, not just with the story, but with her. She talked too much. She had an answer for everything. She didn't have the ragged, incoherent desperation of a mother who had just watched her children shot in front of her. She had the polished, composed delivery of a woman who had prepared. There were a number of things that didn't make sense, even that first night. Welch would later say, she said she was sightseeing, at pitch black, on a rural road, with 3 sleeping kids in the car. None of it made sense. But the investigation was only just beginning. And Diane Downs was about to make a series of decisions so astonishing, so brazenly self-destructive, that they almost defy comprehension. She decided to go on television. The lie starts bleeding. Within weeks of the shootings, while Christie was still recovering from a stroke and Danny was still fighting for his life, Diane Downs was appearing on local and national media. She gave interview after interview. She was animated, energized. She seemed, to the deep discomfort of everyone watching, to be almost enjoying herself. She looked into cameras and spoke about her children with a strange, performative grief that never quite landed right. The pauses were in the wrong places. The emotion came and went too quickly. Local reporter Ann Yeager, who covered the case from the beginning, watched Diane's media appearances and said what a lot of people were thinking. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with this woman. In one interview, Diane was pressed directly what would she say to the theory that she herself had done this. Her response was so strange, so telling, that it has stayed with investigators and journalists ever since. She said, "Why would I have taken my kids to the hospital? Wouldn't I have made sure they were dead and then cried crocodile tears? Not, I would never hurt my children. Not, I love them. I am their mother." She went straight to logistics. She argued her own innocence, the way you'd argue a chess move. That instinct to defend through strategy rather than through love said more about her than any forensic report could. Meanwhile, the physical evidence was telling its own story. The angle and depth of the wound on Diane's arm was wrong. Forensic analysis suggested it was self-inflicted, controlled, deliberate, not consistent with a struggle on a dark road. There was no blood spatter on the driver's side of the car, which directly contradicted her account of where the shooter had been standing. There was no gunpowder residue on the driver's door. And the trajectory of the bullets through the children's bodies was consistent, not with a shooter standing outside the vehicle, but with someone seated in the front seat, turned around, firing backward. Every piece of physical evidence pointed in the same direction. And then investigators found the diaries. Page after page, in Diane's own handwriting, Robert, Robert, Robert. The obsession laid bare in ink, the resentment toward her children, quiet but unmistakable, and a portrait of a woman who had decided, with cold and deliberate clarity, that her children were the obstacle standing between her and the life she wanted. Detective Welch, reading them, later said, "We believe the motive was to get Robert up to Oregon to be with her. Diane considered the kids to be a burden. And as long as he said he wasn't going to be a father to anyone's children, they had to go. They had to go. 3 children, 1 dead, 2 clinging to life, because a man she loved didn't want them around." Diane Downs was arrested on the 28th of February, 1984, 9 months after Old Mohawk Road. But here's the thing about Diane Downs that you have to understand before we walk into that courtroom. She still believed she was going to win. The trial, the pregnancy, and the little girl on the stand. The trial of Diane Downs began in May 1984 inches Eugene, Oregon. And from the very first day, it was unlike anything the state had ever seen. Because Diane walked into that courtroom visibly pregnant. She had deliberately become pregnant before the trial. She had identified a man on her postal route, cultivated a relationship with him, and conceived a child with the specific calculation that a pregnant woman could not possibly be the kind of monster prosecutors were describing. A pregnant woman loves children. A pregnant woman is soft and maternal and sympathetic, or so the logic went. In a media appearance during the trial, she spoke about the pregnancy with a quote so extraordinary that it has followed this case for 40 years. She said she had become pregnant because she missed her children so much. Because children gave her love and stability and a reason to live. That you couldn't replace children, but you could replace the effect they gave you. People in that courtroom didn't know whether to be horrified or stunned into silence. Reporter Ann Yeager, watching from the press gallery, described it simply. Diane had calculated that pregnancy would win her sympathy. If she was pregnant, she must love children. If she loved children, she couldn't have done what they said. It was manipulation in its purest form. But the prosecution had something that no performance, no pregnancy, no courtroom strategy could touch. They had Christie. Christie Downs had spent months in physical and mental rehabilitation. The stroke had stolen her ability to speak. She had to learn, slowly and painfully, and with the courage of someone far beyond her years, how to communicate again, how to form words, how to tell what she knew. When the prosecution finally called her to the stand, she was 9 years old. The courtroom went silent in the way that courtrooms rarely do. A genuine, complete silence, the kind that happens when everyone in the room understands that something important is about to occur. District Attorney Fred Hughey, who had, over the course of the investigation, become deeply and personally devoted to Christie and Danny, and who would eventually adopt both children, approached the stand slowly. He asked Christie, gently and directly, whether she remembered who had shot her on Old Mohawk Road. She said yes. He asked her to tell the court. Christie Downs, 9 years old, having survived a bullet and a stroke and months of recovery and the knowledge of what her mother had done, looked across that courtroom and pointed. Jurors wept, openly, without embarrassment. Diane Downs, at the defense table, barely moved. The verdict came on the 17th of June, 1984. Guilty. Guilty on all charges: murder, attempted murder, criminal assault, life in prison plus 50 years. The judge, in sentencing her, made his intention explicit. He did not want Diane Downs to ever walk free again. Between the verdict and sentencing, the court recessed so that Diane could give birth. A girl she named Amy Elizabeth. The state took the baby immediately and placed her with adoptive parents. She was renamed, grew up in a different family, and built a life that had nothing to do with any of this. Then the prison doors closed. What came after? She escaped in 1987. 3 years into her sentence, Diane Downs scaled an 18-foot razor wire fence at the Oregon Women's Correctional Center and disappeared. For 10 days, she evaded a 14-state manhunt. She had help was hidden in a house nearby by someone connected to a fellow inmate. She was captured on the 21st of July, 1987. During those 10 days, Fred Hughey, who by then had adopted Christie and Danny, lived in genuine fear because Diane's surviving children were living just 66 miles from the prison. And everyone who knew her knew that if she was free, that is where she would go. After her recapture, Hughey successfully lobbied to have her transferred out of Oregon entirely. She was moved to New Jersey, then California, where she has remained ever since. She has appeared before the parole board 4 times. In 2008, in 2010, in 2020, and most recently, in December 2025, just months ago, the board denied her for the 4th time. The board ruled that she remains dangerous, that she has shown no genuine remorse, that she must wait another 10 years before her case can even be reconsidered, at which point she will be 80 years old. Forensic psychiatrists who have evaluated her consistently describe the same cluster of disorders: narcissistic, histrionic, antisocial. One expert reviewing her case called her a deviant sociopath. She is still alive. She is still in prison. And by the structure of her sentence and the judgment of every board that has ever reviewed her case, she will die there. Christie and Danny Downs were adopted by Fred Hughey and his wife, the prosecutor, who fought for them in that courtroom and who decided, somewhere along the way, that fighting for them in court wasn't enough. Christie grew up. She survived. Against every conceivable odd, she survived. What this story is really about. I want to talk to you directly for a moment. Not about Diane Downs the monster. Not about the forensics or the court proceedings or the legal machinery that eventually caught up with her. I want to talk about something this case reveals that is far more uncomfortable than a single woman's crimes. We have a near universal belief that mothers love their children. It is one of the deepest assumptions in human culture, so deep that it functions almost like a law of nature. We build entire systems of trust around it. We extend enormous grace to mothers because of it. And most of the time, that assumption is right. But that assumption is also a blind spot. And Diane Downs knew exactly how to use it. She knew that when she walked into that emergency room carrying her bleeding children, no one's first instinct would be to suspect her. She knew that when she went on television and performed grief, most people watching would give her the benefit of the doubt. She knew that showing up to her own murder trial, pregnant, would make at least some jurors hesitate. She had studied the assumption and built her entire defense on top of it. What caught her, what ultimately dismantled everything she had constructed, was not a dramatic breakthrough. It was patient, methodical, unglamorous work. A detective who trusted his instincts when the story felt wrong. Forensic scientists who let the physical evidence speak louder than the witness. And an 8-year-old girl who fought her way back from a stroke to tell the truth. Christie didn't save herself by being exceptional. She saved herself by surviving long enough to speak. So here's what I want you to take from this story. Not fear, not the paralyzing suspicion that people around you are hiding dark secrets, but this. When something feels wrong, not inconvenient, Not uncomfortable, but genuinely, deeply wrong. Trust that feeling. Name it. Tell someone. Because the people in Diane Downs' life felt it. The nurses felt it the moment she walked in. The detective felt it during the very first interview. The television reporters who watched her performances felt it through their screens. They all felt it. The difference between the ones who acted on that feeling and the ones who didn't is the difference between justice and silence. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply refuse to look away. Cheryl Lynn Downs was 7 years old. She deserved someone who refused to look away. So did Christie. So did Danny. They finally got that someone. Better late than never doesn't feel like enough when we're talking about a 7-year-old girl. But it's what justice looks like when the world is paying attention. Don't stop paying attention